Berlin, 1939. The city is electric with the machinery of war. Soldiers march through the streets beneath enormous swastika banners. Factories run through the night producing weapons and artillery. The German war machine is in full motion, and the Nazi regime projects an image of absolute order, absolute strength, and above all, absolute racial purity. The Aryan ideal, they told the world, was the pinnacle of human civilization. But in the shadows of that polished image, something was very wrong. Berlin in wartime was a city of ghosts. By late 1939, Allied bombing raids were already a looming threat to the German capital, and the Nazi government had responded with a total blackout. Every window covered, every street lamp extinguished. The city that had once blazed with light was plunged into near-total darkness after sunset. Citizens navigated the streets by memory, by touch, by instinct. And the S-Bahn, Berlin's sprawling commuter rail network, ran at night with its interior lights dimmed to almost nothing, carrying exhausted workers home through tunnels of shadow. For most Berliners, the blackout was an inconvenience, an unsettling fact of wartime life. For one man riding those trains, it was something else entirely. It was cover. The first signs that something was wrong surfaced even before the formal outbreak of war. In the late summer of 1939, women in a district on the eastern edge of Berlin began reporting assaults. Violent, sudden, terrifying attacks in the dark near the Rummelsburg rail yard. Several women were beaten. Some were sexually assaulted. A few barely escaped with their lives. Police took the reports. Investigations were opened, and the attacker vanished each time back into the blackout, leaving no name, no face, no trail. Then the war began, and the darkness deepened, and the attack stopped being survivable. On October 4th, 1940, the body of 20-year-old Gertrude Ditter was discovered in her home while her husband Arthur was away on military service. Within hours, the Berlin Criminal Police, known as the Kripo, had taken the case. Suicide was initially suspected as there was a lack of defensive wounds. Within days, they quietly acknowledged they were dealing with a homicide. No suspect, no witnesses, no motive they could readily identify. 2 months later, on the evening of December 4th, workers near the S-Bahn tracks outside Berlin found the body of 26-year-old nurse Elfriede Frank. Her skull had been crushed with tremendous force. She had been thrown from a moving train. Hours after her body was found, police were called to another scene. 19-year-old Irmgard Fries had been found beaten to death near a station on her walk home. 2 victims in a single night. The Kripo began to take the full measure of what they were facing. 3 weeks later, the body of Elisabeth Bungener was found near the tracks, skull fractured. 6 days after that, 46-year-old Gertrude Seward was discovered near the same line, still breathing. She died the next morning without regaining consciousness. Then, on January 5, 1941, 27-year-old Hedwig Ebor was found near the tracks. She was 5 months pregnant. She and her unborn child died the same day. The Kripo now had a pattern. Multiple victims, all women, most traveling alone on or near the S-Bahn at night. The method was brutal and consistent, blunt force trauma and strangulation, followed by the body being thrown from or left near the rail line. Forensic analysis confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was one man, the same hands, the same rage, the same darkness. The homicide unit was placed under the command of Wilhelm Luth, a meticulous and experienced detective who understood immediately that he was working a case unlike any he had encountered before. Not because the crimes were unprecedented, but because the regime that employed him was making it nearly impossible to catch the man responsible. Joseph Goebbels issued a formal directive to German journalists, placing strict limits on any coverage of the murders. The press was effectively silenced. Luth could not issue public warnings. He could not ask Berliners for information. He could not even tell the women of the city to avoid traveling alone at night on the S-Bahn. To do any of that would be to admit that something was deeply wrong in the Nazi capital, and that was something the regime simply would not allow. But the ideological obstruction ran even deeper than censorship. Nazi leadership steered suspicion away from the German population almost immediately. The entire mythology of the Third Reich rested on the premise of Aryan superiority, moral, physical, intellectual. The idea that a German man, a party member, could be responsible for these crimes was, within that framework, nearly unthinkable. And so pressure was applied. Look at the foreign workers. Look at the Jews. Find an outsider. Find an enemy. Find anyone whose guilt would confirm the story the regime was already telling. Lütke pushed back as much as a man in his position could. He deployed 5,000 of Berlin's 8,000 railway workers for interviews. He doubled police patrols on the S-Bahn line. He assigned plainclothes detectives to ride the trains at night. He interviewed survivors with painstaking care. And what those survivors told him consistently was this: their attacker wore the black uniform of a railway worker. The killer was on the inside. Lütke's men began working through railway employee files. Thousands of names, thousands of interviews. They cross-referenced work schedules against the dates and times of the attacks. They mapped the geography of the crimes against the S-Bahn routes and the location of the Reichsbahn's eastern yards. The killings were clustered, always within a narrow corridor of the line between Rummelsburg and Friedrichshagen. Whoever this man was, he knew this stretch of track like the back of his hand. The attacks continued while the investigation ground forward. In February 1941, forensic and autopsy evidence confirmed what Lütke had believed for months. Every murder was the work of a single individual, and that individual almost certainly worked for the railway. Then came the break. A colleague, during a routine interview, mentioned something almost too small to register. He had seen a fellow worker climbing a fence at the Rummelsburg yard one evening during a shift, slipping away without explanation. Detectives noted the date. They compared it against their timeline. It aligned. The man's name was Paul Agorzo. Investigators pulled his file. 30-year-old Agorzo had worked for the Reichsbahn for years, starting as a laborer and rising to assistant signalman on the very stretch of line where the murders had occurred. He was a Nazi party member in good standing. He held the rank of sergeant in the SA. He had a wife, 3 children, a house with a garden in a working-class neighborhood. On paper, he was indistinguishable from 10,000 other men in Berlin. He was brought in for questioning. He deflected. He denied. He attempted to frame himself as a troubled man whose occasional drinking had led to minor indiscretions. The investigators sat across from him and laid out what they had: the timeline, the geography, the fence, the uniform, the survivor testimony. They watched his composure fracture, and then he confessed. 8 murders, 6 attempted murders, 31 cases of assault including rape. Beginning in the summer of 1939, long before anyone had connected the attacks to a single perpetrator, Agorzo had been hunting women in the blackout. He had used his intimate knowledge of the S-Bahn, its routes, its schedules, its dark and isolated platforms, to identify and attack women traveling alone. He had refined his methods after early failures. He had adapted when surveillance increased. He had killed with a consistency and a patience that had allowed him to operate for nearly 2 years inside one of the most surveilled and tightly controlled cities in the world. He tried, in a final act of deflection, to blame his crimes on the corrupting influence of a Jewish doctor. The investigators dismissed the claim. The Nazi Party expelled him immediately. The man who had attended rallies, worn the uniform, marched in formation, paid his dues, and presented himself to the world as a model German citizen was stripped of every designation the regime had given him. He had been, from the beginning, exactly what the ideology insisted could not exist: a monster in an Aryan mask. His trial lasted a single day. He was sentenced to death on July 24, 1941. 2 days later, he was executed by guillotine in Berlin. The Nazi regime never publicly acknowledged what had happened. No press release, no public statement, No warning ever issued to the women of Berlin. The censorship held. The mythology was preserved, at least on paper, but 8 women were dead. Dozens more had been brutalized. And the men who had suppressed the investigation to protect an ideology had allowed it to continue far longer than it should have. There is a footnote to this story that history does not allow us to ignore. One of the Kripo detectives who worked the Agorzo case was a man named Georg Husser. After the war, a West German court found Husser guilty of being an accessory to over 11,000 murders committed by the Nazi mobile killing units that operated in the occupied Soviet Union. He served 6 years of a 15-year sentence and died in 1989. The men who hunted a serial killer in the darkness of wartime Berlin were, in some cases, themselves complicit in mass murder on an incomprehensible scale. The machinery of the Nazi state produced monsters of every kind, in every rank, in every corridor. The S-Bahn murderer was one of them, but he existed inside a system that, for nearly 2 years, chose the image of racial perfection over the lives of the women he killed.